The air is thick with the sulphurous scent of burning city and the metallic tang of fear. April 1945. Stockholm, Sweden. 2000 hours. The Swedish capital, a fragile island of neutrality in a sea of fire, was never quieter, yet never more tense. The distant, throbbing silence of a continent tearing itself apart was the only constant soundtrack. Across the Baltic, the Soviet iron fist was closing around the heart of the Third Reich. Yet here, in the shadows of a grand neutral embassy, another, far more insidious collapse was underway. The unraveling of the Axis alliance itself. This is the central, bitter irony of the war's final weeks. While American soldiers pushed inexorably toward the Elbe, believing Japan and Germany to be a unified fanatical bloc, the reality was a geopolitical farce. The two powers were bound only by a piece of paper, the Tripartite Pact, and separated by a chasm of mutual suspicion, conflicting aims, and 20,000 miles of ocean. And now, the war was exposing the hypocrisy of that arrangement with terrifying finality. Our story begins with a man trapped in a paradox, Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue, the Japanese military attaché in Stockholm. Arisue was no mere diplomat. He was an intelligence operative, a highly placed man from the Imperial General Headquarters, whose mission was to maintain the facade of Axis strength, even as his own secure teletype cables from Tokyo screamed a different truth. His primary purpose had shifted from intelligence gathering to the desperate pursuit of the impossible, an exit. For weeks, Arisue had watched the news dispatches, each one a fresh, crushing defeat for his German allies. The Rhine crossed. Vienna fallen, the Red Army on the Oder. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the core that Germany's unconditional surrender was a matter of days. And what Arisue knew, every strategic mind in Tokyo knew. The collapse of Germany would instantly unleash the full, terrifying power of the combined Allied war machine. Millions of men, thousands of ships, and the entire industrial might of the United States upon the homeland of Japan. The situation demanded action that defied protocol. It required a gamble. Arisue was tasked with establishing the earliest possible contact with the Allied powers, not to discuss terms, not yet, but simply to open a back channel, a discreet whisper in the ear of the enemy, before the final cataclysmic act of the war, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, began. The Japanese government, still clinging to the ludicrous hope of a mediated peace facilitated by the Soviet Union, a Soviet Union that was secretly preparing to invade them, needed an alternative. They needed the Americans to know they were willing to talk. The atmosphere in Stockholm's diplomatic circles was electric with secret meetings and double dealings. The Germans, paralyzed by the delusion of their Führer's wonder weapons, were too arrogant to notice the quiet treachery of their Asiatic partners. But the Americans were watching, and they were listening. In a nondescript office across the city, an American operative with the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, held a piece of intelligence that would soon ignite Arisue's desperate gambit. This was Alan Dulles' domain, the center of Allied covert operations in Europe. They were intercepting cables, decoding signals, and monitoring every foreign national. They had already brokered one of the war's great secret surrenders, the Nazi forces in Italy, codenamed Operation Sunrise. They were primed for another. The whisper began not in a smoky room but on a frozen lake. A neutral Swedish businessman, a quiet intermediary with ties to both the Japanese community and the American embassy, initiated the delicate dance. The message was veiled, almost innocuous. The situation in Tokyo is becoming serious. The government seeks a path to peace that does not involve the loss of the imperial institution. For the American analysts reading the intercepted report, this was seismic. It was the first concrete crack in the monolithic facade of Japanese fanaticism. What they did not know, and what history would later reveal, was the sheer, desperate internal struggle within the Japanese leadership that had authorized this move. Was this a genuine plea for peace, or a tactical ruse to divide the Allies and stall the inevitable? The Americans had to proceed with paralyzing caution. They had to assume the latter. This is the iron cage of high-stakes diplomacy in war. Every word is a weapon, every gesture a potential trap. The Americans, focused on unconditional surrender, were supremely suspicious. The Japanese, seeking to preserve the divine status of their emperor, were fundamentally unwilling to meet that term. This chasm of expectation was the greatest obstacle. As the Battle of Berlin raged into its final hours, turning the German capital into an inferno, General Arisu's desperation grew into panic. He saw the future in the burning ruins of his ally, absolute, total annihilation. The window for a negotiated peace was closing rapidly. He doubled down. He initiated a second, more brazen approach, abandoning the subtle hints and moving toward explicit request. He needed a direct channel to the Americans. He needed to talk about terms. What he did not know, and what he could never have known, was that thousands of miles away in a secret facility in New Mexico, the very definition of unconditional surrender was about to be redefined by a terrifying singular force. A force that would render all his intricate diplomatic maneuverings obsolete in a flash of blinding light. This first desperate gambit in Stockholm was not a strategy for victory. It was a race against time and technology, a race to save a nation from the consequences of its own relentless fanatical pride. The curtain was rising on the final, most terrifying act of the war, and a small Japanese general in a neutral city was about to place the biggest wager in his nation's history. If you found the beginning of this desperate story compelling, please subscribe and click the bell icon for the full series. Your support allows us to continue bringing these untold chapters of history to light. May 1945. Bern, Switzerland. Morning. The collapse of the Third Reich was not a sudden bang. It was a slow, agonizing disintegration, spreading like a plague of chaos across Europe. But in the serene, meticulously ordered environment of Bern, Switzerland, the impact of Berlin's fall was felt not in the form of tanks or bombs, but in a sudden, frantic surge of desperate diplomacy. Bern was the ultimate clearinghouse for secrets, and the man at its center was Alan Dulles, the OSS chief, the architect of clandestine operations. Dulles was a seasoned player, a master of the double cross, and his primary mission was the neutralization of the German war machine. He had succeeded brilliantly, but the moment the German surrender was formalized, Dulles's attention immediately pivoted, turning his razor-sharp focus 30 degrees eastward toward the Pacific. He knew that any Japanese approach, no matter how remote, had to be taken seriously, and the approaches were now multiplying. The Japanese embassy in Bern, much like the one in Stockholm, was a pressure cooker of conflicting orders and personal terror. Ambassador Shunichi Kase, a man of profound intellect and sober judgment, understood the reality. The war was lost. His government's continued belligerence was not strategic. It was suicidal. Unlike the Stockholm general, Kase was engaging in a different form of backchannel, the civilian route. He was utilizing old established contacts, Swiss bankers, diplomats, and even sympathetic businessmen, to test the waters. The most critical of these contacts was a former Swiss minister, who knew both Kase and the American delegation. The Japanese message transmitted through this Swiss conduit was more detailed, more specific, and therefore more dangerous to both sides. It contained a vital caveat. Japan's greatest concern is not to secure the mere peace and welfare of the people of Japan, but to maintain the dignity and prestige of the imperial house. For the Allies, this single line was the core of the dilemma. Unconditional surrender, the non-negotiable term established by Roosevelt and Churchill, meant total capitulation, with no guarantees for the post-war structure of the enemy state. To accept a conditional surrender protecting the emperor would be to potentially invalidate the entire unified Allied war policy. It would be a historical irony of immense proportions. Germany had fallen without condition, yet Japan, the minor partner, might escape with terms. Inside the OSS headquarters, Dulles and his analysts engaged in a tense debate. Was the emperor a necessary puppet for control, a figurehead whose survival would ensure a swift, orderly end to the fighting and prevent a million-man bloodbath on the beaches of Kyushu? Or was he the symbol of the fanaticism that had driven the atrocities of the Pacific War, a symbol that must be eradicated for a lasting peace? The irony was not lost on the men studying the reports. The Japanese, having thrown in their lot with Hitler and Mussolini, were now trying to save their national structure by appealing to the democratic principles and pragmatism of the very people they had attacked at Pearl Harbor. It was a desperate gamble rooted in a profound miscalculation about Allied unity. The crucial document that emerged from Bern was a preliminary peace proposal. It laid out a series of Japanese concessions: withdrawal from occupied territories, disarmament, and even acceptance of Allied occupation. But it was all contingent on that single, non-negotiable demand: the safety and continuation of the imperial throne. When this proposal finally reached Washington, it created a political firestorm. Secretary of State Cordell Hull was adamant: no deals. The fanatical military element in Tokyo could easily exploit any perceived weakness. Surrender must be unconditional to crush the Japanese military spirit entirely. Conversely, military leaders, particularly those planning the horrific logistics of Operation Downfall, the invasion, saw the potential value in a conditional surrender. General George C. Marshall understood the grim arithmetic. Preserving the emperor could potentially save hundreds of thousands of Allied lives. The debate was raging behind closed doors in Washington precisely as the Allied forces were celebrating VE Day. While ticker-tape parades filled the streets of London and New York, the leaders of the free world were grappling with the question of how to end the Pacific War without bankrupting their nations in blood. The tragedy of the situation was the gap in communication. Ambassador Kase, watching the world burn around him from his Swiss refuge, genuinely believed his appeals were reaching the highest echelons and being considered. What he didn't know was the sheer scale of the Allied commitment to the unconditional principle, nor the inherent distrust caused by the Japanese military's own fanatical propaganda. More darkly, Kase and Arisui were being undercut by their own government. At the same time, they were pleading for peace in Europe. The Japanese military leadership in Tokyo was issuing increasingly hysterical orders for the entire nation to prepare for a suicidal defense of the home islands. The peace feelers were a desperate measure by a few enlightened diplomats, not the consensus of the war cabinet. The clock ticked towards midnight. Dulles, a man who dealt in grey, understood the value of the information, even if he couldn't act on it. He ensured that the communications from Bern were logged, analyzed, and filed. The diplomats had opened the door a crack, but whether the American leadership would choose to walk through it or simply kick it down remained the most terrible question of the summer of 1945. The desperate gambit was now fully engaged, but its success depended entirely on how the Americans valued the life of a single divine man in Tokyo against the lives of their own soldiers. June 1945. Moscow, Soviet Union. Night. The scene shifts dramatically eastward to the frigid, uncompromising capital of the Soviet Union. Here, the irony of the Japanese diplomatic effort reaches its highest, most tragic peak. For months, the primary official policy of the Japanese Supreme War Direction Council, the Big Six, had been to use the Soviet Union as a mediator for peace. This was the ultimate delusion, a fantasy built on a complete failure to grasp geopolitical reality. The key figure in this theater was Ambassador Naotake Sato. Unlike his counterparts in Stockholm and Bern, Sato's task was not covert. It was tragically overt. He was instructed to meet with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and appeal to Stalin's supposedly benign neutrality, requesting that the Soviets intervene with the Americans to secure a just peace. What the Japanese War Council didn't know, and what their diplomats in Europe were desperately trying to circumvent, was that the Soviet Union had already committed to entering the war against Japan. At the Yalta Conference in February, Stalin had promised Roosevelt and Churchill that 3 months after the defeat of Germany, the Red Army would join the fight in the Pacific. This was not neutrality. This was a guaranteed, impending betrayal. Ambassador Sato knew intuitively that his mission was a fool's errand. He was an experienced diplomat, a man who had seen the brutal, rapacious face of the Soviet state up close. He recognized the chilling, dismissive smirk on Molotov's face when the topic of mediation was raised. The Soviet response was always the same: evasion, delay, and a request for more concessions, more territory, more resources. Each delay was not a sign of diplomatic negotiation, but a ticking clock counting down to the date of invasion. The desperation of Tokyo's leadership was so profound that they clung to the Soviet mediation myth like a life raft. The military faction, the hardliners who had the final say, believed that as long as the emperor was protected, they could negotiate an end to the American blockade and preserve the honor of the imperial army. This was the cognitive dissonance that Arisu and Kase were fighting against, a military faction preparing for a glorious final battle while simultaneously demanding peace through a treacherous intermediary. The Japanese decision to rely on the Soviets was the single greatest strategic error of the late war. It was a fatal distraction. Every day the government wasted waiting for Molotov to reply was a day the Americans were advancing their invasion plans and, more crucially, completing the final assembly of the ultimate weapon. While Sato was being stalled in Moscow, the covert channels in Europe were proving far more efficient, though less palatable to Tokyo. The reports from Stockholm and Bern, emphasizing the American focus on unconditional surrender and the utter impossibility of Soviet neutrality, were being filtered and suppressed by the military hardliners upon arrival in Tokyo. The messengers were being shot, metaphorically, not because their news was false, but because it was too inconvenient. One decoded report from Bern, which highlighted the American suspicion that any peace offer was merely a ploy to rearm for a future conflict, was particularly incendiary. The irony was, the Japanese military itself was using the peace feelers precisely as a ploy to buy time for the final suicidal defense plans. A Japanese military hardliner's internal monologue, based on records. Let the diplomats chatter with the Americans about peace. Their chatter is a shield. It gives the Americans pause. Every moment of their deliberation is a moment we gain for mobilizing the People's Volunteer Fighting Corps. Their peace talk is a smokescreen behind which we prepare the divine wind. The ultimate victory lies in the sacrifice, not in the diplomacy. The tragic result, the official diplomatic policy and the secret diplomatic efforts were working at cross purposes, cancelling each other out and leaving the Japanese government fundamentally paralyzed. The Americans, observing the dueling messages, a request for peace from Europe, coupled with fanatical public statements from Tokyo, could only conclude that the Japanese were fundamentally untrustworthy. The world was moving on. Germany had surrendered. The European war machine was being dismantled and shipped east. The full weight of Allied focus was now squarely on the Pacific. The desperation in Bern and Stockholm, the honest, pragmatic pleas of men who saw the abyss, were being drowned out by the noise of their own fanatical leadership in Tokyo. The Soviet Union, the promised savior, was in reality the grim executioner. Molotov was simply waiting for the clock, the 3-month window after VE Day, to expire. The ultimate deception was being played out on a grand continental stage, and Ambassador Sato was the unwitting centerpiece of his nation's final, most profound self-deception. The stage was set for the last great diplomatic conference of the war, and the desperate Japanese efforts in Europe would be utterly dwarfed by what was about to occur. July 1945. Potsdam, Germany. 1500 hours. The summer of 1945. The leaders of the victorious Allied powers, Harry S. Truman, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, convened in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam amid the shattered ruins of the former German Empire. The purpose of the conference was ostensibly to settle the fate of post-war Europe, but the unspoken urgent crisis hanging over every meeting was the Pacific. Truman, barely 3 months into the presidency, was carrying a secret far more potent than any military division. He had arrived at Potsdam knowing that the world's first atomic weapon was scheduled for its final test, the Trinity test, in the New Mexico desert. The news from the covert diplomatic channels in Stockholm and Bern, the Japanese appeals for a conditional surrender, was on his desk, meticulously analyzed by Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson and others. This is the pivotal moment of strategic choice. The desperate gambit of the Japanese diplomats had reached the highest level. Should the Allies respond to the feelers from Europe, offering a guarantee for the Emperor to secure a quick end to the war, or should they proceed with the policy of unconditional surrender, backed now by a weapon of unimaginable power? The internal American debate was fierce. Stimson and former Ambassador Joseph Grew argued strongly that a guarantee for the Emperor was the only way to induce surrender without a costly invasion. They pointed to the Bern and Stockholm reports. The Japanese were willing to sacrifice everything except the imperial institution. To ignore this was to invite Operation Downfall the invasion, and the loss of 1 million lives. The opposing view, held by Secretary of State James Burns and others, was that any deviation from unconditional surrender would embolden the Japanese hardliners, be seen as a sign of weakness, and could alienate the American public, who demanded retribution for Pearl Harbor. Furthermore, the political optics of offering terms to a nation that had surrendered unconditionally would be catastrophic. Truman, a man of decisive action, chose a middle path, one informed by the growing confidence in his secret weapon. He chose to issue an ultimatum. On July 26, 1945, the leaders of the United States, Great Britain and China issued the Potsdam Declaration. This declaration laid out the terms for Japan's surrender: complete demilitarization, punishment of war criminals, occupation, and the establishment of a new order of peace. Crucially, it did not explicitly guarantee the emperor's safety, but it vaguely stated that the ultimate form of Japan's government would be determined by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. This deliberate ambiguity was the Allied answer to the Japanese diplomatic pleas from Europe. It was the crack in the door the diplomats had sought, but it was too subtle, too carefully worded to satisfy the military hardliners in Tokyo. The Japanese reaction to the Potsdam Declaration was catastrophic. The military cabinet, still entrenched in the fantasy of a final glorious defense and still desperately waiting for a response from the neutral Soviet Union, dismissed the declaration outright. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, under pressure from the hardliners, used the word mokusatsu, meaning to ignore, to treat with silent contempt, to describe their response. This act of historical arrogance sealed Japan's fate. By mokusatsu, the Japanese government was not merely ignoring an ultimatum. They were ignoring their own diplomats' frantic pleas. They were ignoring the hard-won intelligence gathered in Bern and Stockholm, which clearly stated that this was the best and perhaps last offer they would receive. The tragedy deepens with the final, ultimate irony of Potsdam. As the ultimatum was issued, Ambassador Sato in Moscow finally managed a meeting with Molotov. Sato, desperate, pleaded for the Soviets to intervene to mediate a more favorable peace. Molotov's response was chillingly brief and utterly dismissive. He was silent on the matter of mediation and focused instead on the upcoming conference in Moscow. What Sato did not know was that Molotov was not simply delaying. He was running down the clock to the moment the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan, fulfilling their Yalta commitment. The Japanese leadership, betting their nation's survival on the neutrality of a power that had already committed to their destruction, had fundamentally misjudged the end game. Truman, upon hearing of the mokusatsu response, had his final answer. The diplomatic route, painstakingly opened by Arisu and Casey, had been slammed shut by the hubris of their own government. With the success of the Trinity test now confirmed, the order was given. The silence from Washington, following the issuance of the Potsdam Declaration, was not hesitation. It was preparation. The desperate gambit had failed, not because the Americans were unwilling to talk, but because the Japanese government was too unwilling to listen. August 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. 08:15 hours. The end arrived not with a negotiation, but with a terrifying, instantaneous and singular act of total destruction. The firebreak that the diplomatic efforts in Europe had sought to prevent was now a blinding reality. The dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki rendered all the intricate diplomatic maneuvering of the preceding months utterly, tragically irrelevant. The discussions of conditional surrender, the fate of the emperor, and the Soviet mediation myth were vaporized in two distinct, terrible flashes. The irony of the diplomats' efforts is profound. Arisu and Case, the men who saw the collapse of Germany as a chilling premonition, had attempted to use the ruins of Europe as a cautionary tale for their own nation. They failed, not due to lack of effort, but due to the paralyzing schism between the military and the civilian leadership in Tokyo. The military's stubborn rejection of the Potsdam Declaration, their fateful mokusatsu, was based on the premise that they could still inflict horrific casualties on the invading Americans, forcing a better peace. The atomic bomb instantly invalidated this premise. No defense, no matter how fanatical, could counter the single-weapon annihilation of an entire city. The final, catastrophic blow came swiftly after the second bomb. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8th. The presumed mediator had become the executioner. The ultimate double-cross was complete, proving Ambassador Sato's worst fears and invalidating the entire official peace strategy of the Japanese War Council. They had relied on the very power that was pledged to destroy them. Faced with a catastrophe of biblical scale, 2 nuclear attacks and a massive Soviet invasion, the Japanese government finally cracked. The emperor himself, Hirohito, intervened in the stalemated War Council, a move of unprecedented and divine authority. He declared that to continue the war would be to annihilate the Japanese people. The decision was made to accept the Potsdam Declaration. But even in this final desperate act, the ghost of the European gambit prevailed. The final message of surrender, sent through the neutral Swiss government, the same conduit used by Ambassador Casey months earlier, was critically conditioned upon the understanding that the emperor's status would be preserved. The American response, drafted by Secretary of State Burns, was the final answer to the whispers from Bern. It reiterated that the emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers, and that the ultimate form of government of Japan shall be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. It was the same ambiguity from Potsdam, but this time the pressure was too great to refuse. Japan had to accept. The desperate diplomatic efforts in Europe, the secret meeting on the frozen lake in Stockholm, the proposals filtered through Swiss banking contacts in Bern, did not prevent the atomic bomb. But they were not entirely in vain. They served as the crucial intelligence, the undeniable proof for President Truman and his advisors that the Japanese government was fundamentally divided and that the emperor's status was the single, non-negotiable term for peace. This knowledge informed the careful, ambiguous wording of the Potsdam Declaration, offering the slightest crack in the door. Without those feelers, the final surrender might have been delayed further, resulting in the planned invasion of Kyushu and a bloodbath on both sides. The diplomats' desperate gamble, tragically overshadowed by the technological and military climax, ultimately provided the necessary political foundation for the final, conditional acceptance of unconditional surrender. In the end, the emperor was preserved, subject to Allied authority. The desperate gamble of the men in Stockholm and Bern to save the imperial house from the consequences of its own military's fanaticism had succeeded, but at the cost of 2 cities. The ruins of Berlin had warned the Japanese of their future. They did not listen. They paid the ultimate price, and the diplomats' failure was a testament to the tragic human cost of strategic delusion. The history of war is often written in the clash of arms, but sometimes the true turning points are found in the desperate, unheard whispers of a diplomat in a neutral city. Thank you for exploring this pivotal and often overlooked chapter of World War II history. If you wish to continue uncovering the world's most crucial untold stories, please like this video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to our channel for more deep-dive historical analysis.